And you have to understand that on the geopolitical scale, at that level, Copeland says, which should be obvious, I think, to people who've studied this very much, is that we're not talking or looking at right and wrong. There's not good guys, bad guys. Anytime you see the good guys, bad guys, that's propaganda. It's amoral. And really, that's the title of the book, is the amorality of power politics. The amorality of power politics, the game of nations. So when you're seeing a lot of good guy, bad guy talk, villain talk, hero talk, G.I. Joe type stuff, Cobra, that is propaganda. It's propaganda on the level of G.I. Joe, actually. And he says that, of course, obviously all of this stuff is run by covert operations and what he calls crypto diplomacy, and he calls himself a crypto diplomat, and this means that he was one of the guys who was making the behind the scenes deals, right? X-Files, the Syndicate, the Smoky Room guys. He talks about the amorality of politics, as we said, that it is all relative. There's no good guys, bad guys. There's winners and losers. Winning, right? Remember Charlie Sheen 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Winning, that is a great summation, catchphrase for the modus operandi of geopolitics. And I also found it fascinating on page 21 that he actually says that the working group that he was a part of, which was kind of a predecessor to the CIA and OSS and then into the period of the CIA, was the Games Center, it was called by their guys. And he says that the report from Iron Mountain was based on them. So, yes, the report from Iron Mountain is somewhat of a satire, but it is actually based on a real working group, which is these guys. So, yes, the report from Iron Mountain, according to Miles Copeland, is more or less true. But again, satirized as a kind of psyop within a psyop. So here you have it from the CIA guy himself. Now, game theory. This is another fascinating aspect that you would not expect to be involved in the 1969 publication by this CIA operative of computer guesswork. Now, you've heard me probably in talks many times mention Isaac Asimov, the idea of, in the Foundation series, feeding information into a giant computer to have a predictive algorithm to track mass movements. This is mentioned in Copeland's book. Copeland says at this time in the 60s, they were doing this very thing. They had the computers that could input a bunch of different multi-level information and then spit out some kind of guess. I don't know how those giant old computers, maybe they didn't have big ass room sized computers in the 60s like we think. Maybe there was actually more advanced stuff that they had. I don't know, but regardless, maybe that giant room that we see in old movies and stuff, of giant wheels and tapes of computer tapes, right? Like Betamaxes or something. Giant Betamax computers that maybe they actually could do predictive algorithm work. That's what Copeland claims, at least. So war games, right? You remember war games in the 80s. Copeland is saying they were doing war game stuff in the 60s with computers. So I love the fascinating section on pages 26 and 27. I think everybody kind of has this sense that the CIA lies as a matter of policy. But it's also that the CIA then tells the government, and of course the CFR kind of telling the CIA, and then by extension the government and so forth, the propaganda outlets, the media, how to lie. He's very candid about this on page 26. Well, of course we lie. He says, what do you think? We're going to tell you the truth? We're not going to tell you the truth. We're just going to nonstop lie. That's what he says. So amazing admission there. Anybody says, he's talking about on the mass scale there. In this book, which I'm sure there's some disinformation in this book as well. But regardless, the admissions are still of such magnitude that, really to understand this book, I think gives you an even greater picture of how the world is run, which is what we've really been trying to chronicle here at Jay's Analysis and in these years of lectures and talks and interviews. And he talks about, for example, regime changes. 29, he was very interested in regime changes and applying game theory to how to enact a coup or how to enact a revolution. So you've heard us talk about Gene Sharp and the philosophy of created and marketed revolutions, so-called non-democratic revolutions, and the Arab Spring and all that. That's all old stuff, right? This goes back to this period, and it's during this period when they were really studying these techniques and strategies that we've talked about in the Brzezinski works, or that we've talked about in the various regime change and soft power, soft coup type situations over the last several years. But basically, everything that I've said is backed up and true in Game of Nations. So that's all you need, right? Now, why do they do this? Well, because of the need to create, he says, a brotherhood of man, to create a stable world order. And that's page 32 and 33. And he says that basically it doesn't really matter what the people's ideologies are, as long as the regime, the U.S. regime, the establishment, thinks that they can steer the course of the ideology of the movement or whatever. So in other words, they don't have to always cause the coup. They don't have to always be involved directly in staging it or running it. If they already think that they can control where it's going. That's really the purpose of all this. Studying the trends and so forth, as we've talked about recently with Tavistock, then they don't really have to stage every single coup. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's kind of what Copeland talks about in the book. And he says that the U.S., after World War II, Bretton Woods, really took on the role of world police. That was the big change from maybe the U.S. prior to 20th century and then into the 20th century, is that it was decided by the Atlanticists, by the Royal Society and other groups, the Milner Group, that the United States would become world police, team world police. America, F yeah, right? And the U.S. took over the Pax Britannia, right? And so now it's the Pax Americana. And what is the big problem in the Middle East, according to Miles Copeland? Well, it's really managing the situations of Zionism and oil. That's it. Is it because it's all about the promotion of Zionism? Well, no. First of all, you've got a whole bunch of Arabs, right? And other ethnic groups as well in the Middle East. So it's not just Zionism. What he means is the controversy of Zionism. So for the game player perspective, Copeland is saying it's a matter of managing all of the conflicts to the most advantageous outlook in the long run, any of them. So you want to have good relations with the Arabs, the anti-Zionists, as well as the Zionists, the Israelis. Copeland says this many times, and in fact he even says that when the CIA supports the rise of certain leaders, if that leader is anti-Zionist, they'll fully support an anti-Zionist candidate, as long as they think that in the long run the outcomes will be advantageous to Western corporate interests, you see. So it has nothing to do with the ideologies ultimately. So he says that they will rig elections. They will, but ultimately during this period, what the CIA was really interested in was bringing democracy to the Middle East. This was the older CIA plan, by the way, before it kind of shifted over to the support of the jihad, right, using the old British model. And so that's why the CIA had such a vested interest in supporting candidates who were more so-called democratic, or this whole human rights nonsense, this made-up stuff about, oh, we want to come in and bring elections to your country. We want to bring women's rights to your country and all this stuff. We want to upgrade your, you need to upgrade, like your phone need to upgrade, right? You need to upgrade your backwards-ass country. And how does that happen? Well, it happens by the oil companies and the big banks coming in and saying, we want to industrialize your country. You've got probably resources that we'd like to have. And if you let us in, we will revolutionize, modernize all of your nation, but you're going to have to go along with all the other things that we would like to see. And so really it's kind of like a big business plan. You've heard people say this many times, and that's what Copeland says, is that it's oil and money, and if you don't go along, and it's very lucrative, that's why this is so successful, is that it's very lucrative. If you don't go along, you might die, or there's a revolution, or there's a coup, or there's an assassination, or whatever. But if you do go along, it's very lucrative, especially if you're the president, right, of some country. Especially if your coup is successful and the CIA likes your coup and they like where you're going. You see, it's very business oriented. That's why it's winners and losers, not good guys, bad guys. But I thought it was fascinating that during this period, Copeland says on pages 45 to 50 that they were very obsessed with this idea of bringing voting to the Middle East. Why were they so interested in voting? Well, he tells you because they were studying techniques of subversion, of psychological warfare, of nudging. Remember Cass Sunstein talking about nudging? Well, here's Miles Copeland talking about nudging back in 1969. And he says that the voting stuff had to do with Madison Avenue guys being brought in to study mass manipulation and to try and test different techniques. So basically kind of a giant lab, the Middle East is here from the technocratic perspective. So there's many interests, many angles at work here in what's going on in the Middle East during this period. And it's not all business. There's also other aspects, like we said, of studying demographics, studying ethnography, getting all the markets, the niches just right to where the propaganda can be tailored to different groups. That's why the CIA has no problem supporting the pro-Israeli candidate one time or the anti-Zionist candidate another time. That's what he explicitly says. So what about Syria? Well, Copeland frames it like they wanted to modernize Syria because they really cared about the Syrian people. Well, Syria also has things that the West was interested in, like oil. And so in 1949, the USA supported an actual straight-up revolutionary coup by Husni Zaim. And so he was the head of the Syrian army, and the CIA supported him in taking over. And they enforced this regime change, but according to Copeland, it was not the best approach. It wasn't as successful as they hoped. The military coup, which those kind of things don't last very long, it wasn't successful for very long, and then you had a succession of coups later. But what Copeland does say is that this whole failure, supposed, wasn't ultimately a failure because it was just a means by which they could study and perfect the technique of regime change and political manipulation and coup.